Iranian media announcing that Iran had fired live missiles. Iran had announced a maritime military exercise in waterways that are crucial international trade routes through which 20% of the world's oil passes.
9:37 a.m. Persian Gulf. The sun sits high over the water, turning the surface into a sheet of blinding light. From a distance, the sea looks peaceful. Civilian tankers follow their lanes. The horizon is flat, uninterrupted. At the center of a wide defensive circle moves a U.S. carrier strike group built around the USS Abraham Lincoln. Formation spacing is textbook. Speed is steady. No abrupt turns. No visible tension. For the sailors on deck, it is another controlled transit through one of the most strategically sensitive waterways on Earth. But calm in the Persian Gulf has a history of being temporary. At the outer edge of the surveillance envelope, where radar returns begin separating real contacts from heat distortion and sea clutter, something faint appears. Not a fighter jet, not a missile, not even fast. Small signatures, low altitude, slow movement, indistinct. At first glance, they resemble noise, objects skimming close to the surface, partially masked by waves and civilian traffic. Their radar cross-section is minimal. Their paths are not direct. They neither rush toward the fleet nor retreat. They drift, but they drift with intention. There are no identification beacons, no radio acknowledgements, no navigation lights visible from distance. Every standard attempt at communication is met with silence. This is not a malfunction. It is a calculation. The objects approach incrementally, closing just enough distance to demand monitoring, but not enough to justify immediate engagement. They are testing the invisible line between observation and provocation. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, the reaction is not dramatic. No alarms, no raised voices. Tracks are assigned quietly, altitude updated, speed measured, heading lines redrawn every few seconds to determine whether drift is random or deliberate. The first layer holds higher altitude, nearly stationary relative to the formation. From that vantage point, they are positioned to record escort ship spacing, aircraft deck operations, and movement rhythm. Below them, another layer flies low, extremely low. So low their signatures flicker against wave reflections. These are not expensive systems. They are not built to survive prolonged confrontation. They are built to appear, persist, record, and disappear. On the surface, small fast boats are visible at long range. They do not surge forward. They do not form attack lines. Instead, they move at low speed, occasionally altering course before resuming earlier headings. Each shift forces a reassessment. Each contact requires attention. The objective is not collision, it is saturation. The airspace and sea space around the carrier are gradually filled with enough minor movements that attention must stretch across multiple sectors simultaneously. This is pressure through persistence. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has used variations of this method before. The goal is not immediate escalation. It is to measure reaction time, to observe posture, to determine whether the fleet adjusts speed, alters formation, or signals warning thresholds. But something subtle is already shifting. The longer these UAVs and boats remain within detection range, the deeper they embed themselves inside a fully controlled tracking envelope. Every second they linger, they are not only observing, they are being recorded. The U.S. formation does not change. Speed constant, course steady. No public radio broadcast, no visible deterrent display. From the outside, the strike group appears indifferent. Inside the sensor network, however, Clarity builds through accumulation. Each UAV is assigned its own track, each altitude variation logged, each minor speed fluctuation stored. No target dominates the screen. Instead, the picture becomes sharper through steady discipline. Naval helicopters move along the outer edge of the formation, not closing aggressively, not retreating inward. They sweep visually between civilian vessels, confirming radar returns without forcing confrontation. Above, layered radar coverage extends outward, overlapping fields of detection. There is no scramble of fighters, no need. Patience does the work. The probing continues. A high-altitude UAV edges slightly closer to the predefined approach boundary. It does not cross outright. It settles just inside what could still be interpreted as a gray zone. The lower-tier UAVs mimic this movement. Oblique angles, slight reductions in speed, gradual re-acceleration. Each shift appears minor. Collectively, they compress distance. The fast boats at the surface remain dispersed. None cross an obvious red line, yet none withdraw. The sea remains calm, the sky remains clear, but the operational space has transformed into a layered chessboard. Every movement now exists inside a system that has already defined its thresholds long before this morning began. And while the Iranian UAVs attempt to measure the fleet's tolerance, a more important calculation is underway. Not about who approached first, but about who decides when the test ends. And that decision point is approaching. The distance markers begin to shrink. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. Inside the carrier's surveillance network, the high-altitude UAV that had been hovering near the outer boundary adjusts its position by a few degrees. Its track line now intersects deeper into the defined safety envelope. It is still not aggressive, still not fast, but the intent is no longer ambiguous. Below it, two low-flying UAVs reduce altitude even further, nearly blending into the glare of reflected sunlight on the water. Their radar returns flicker in and out, forcing the tracking system to refine classification filters. This is not random flight behavior. It is probing through ambiguity. The U.S. fleet does not respond theatrically. No sudden course change, no acceleration. The strike group continues forward as if the sky were empty. Flight operations on the deck of USS Abraham Lincoln proceed on schedule. Aircraft taxi. Crews move with practiced rhythm. Launch and recovery cycles continue uninterrupted. That continuity is deliberate. The message is subtle but unmistakable. Normal operations remain normal. Inside the command center, however, tracking fidelity increases. Update intervals shorten. Heading projections are recalculated more frequently. Probability assessments refine. One of the high-altitude UAVs stabilizes just inside the inner threshold of the approach zone. Not deeply, but enough. It does not answer radio calls. It does not turn away. It holds. Silence stretches for several seconds longer than before. The thresholds that were established long before this transit began are not flexible. They are mathematical. Distance, speed, altitude, persistence time, all defined in advance. The UAV has now satisfied the final variable. The decision is not debated. It is executed. There is no dramatic countdown, no public announcement. On the tracking display, the steady point representing the high-altitude UAV remains fixed for a brief moment longer. Then it disappears. No prolonged explosion, no visible fireball from the deck. Just a clean removal from the screen. The lower-tier UAVs respond not with aggression, but with hesitation. Their flight paths waver. One shifts slightly away from the formation. Another slows, but one continues forward. Its altitude remains low. Its track inches closer to the central ring. Again, communication attempts receive no reply. Again, distance markers tick down. The intervention is precise. The second disappearance occurs even more quietly than the first. A faint contact dims, then vanishes. There is no cascade of chaos, no rush of new alarms. Each engagement is isolated, contained, and timed exactly to penetration depth. On the surface, the dispersed fast boats hesitate. Their movement patterns lose rhythm. One reduces speed abruptly. Another alters heading away from the formation by several degrees before correcting, then turning further outward. The layered structure of the probe begins to unravel. Above, another UAV attempts to hold position at mid-altitude, perhaps hoping the earlier disappearances were technical failures. It edges forward. The system does not rush. Tracking remains steady. Parameters confirm. Threshold met. The third signal disappears. This time, the reaction below is immediate. The remaining low-flying UAVs reverse course in shallow arcs, attempting to regain distance without accelerating dramatically. The fast boats begin widening their separation from the strike group. There is still no pursuit, no aggressive maneuvering from the U.S. fleet. The carrier maintains speed. Escort ships hold spacing. Helicopters continue their measured patrol arcs. What changes is not the formation, but the space around it. Within minutes, the density of contacts drops sharply. Where multiple layered tracks once filled the outer envelope, gaps appear. The surface radar picture clears first. Fast boats retreat beyond comfortable monitoring range. Their signatures shrink and eventually merge into distant clutter. In the air, the remaining UAV signals fade one by one as they increase separation. No further thresholds are tested. The strike group does not broadcast victory. It does not release a public warning. It does not alter its course. Flight operations continue as if the sky had never been interrupted. But something fundamental has shifted. The airspace surrounding the formation is no longer an experimental zone. It has been reset. The key difference is timing. The fleet did not respond at the first sign of approach. It did not escalate when the gray zone formed. It waited. It allowed behavior patterns to reveal themselves fully. And when the predefined boundary was crossed, the response was limited, precise, and controlled. No more than necessary, no less than required. From a material perspective, the probing package has been neutralized. High-altitude observers are gone. Low-level UAVs no longer skim the waves nearby. Fast attack boats withdraw without ceremony. The sea returns to visual calm. But this calm is not tentative. It is established. The data collected during the encounter flows into analysis channels. Time spent inside the approach zone. Coordination between aerial and surface layers. Adjustment speed after the first disappearance. All recorded. All categorized. The side that initiated the probe now understands something critical. The defensive system did not reveal its full structure. It did not show every layer. It showed only enough. And that restraint carries weight. Because dominance in these waters is not determined by who approaches more often. It is determined by who decides when proximity ends. The USS Abraham Lincoln continues its transit through the Persian Gulf without deviation. Speed constant. Heading unchanged. No visible sign remains that multiple UAVs had occupied the surrounding airspace just minutes earlier. The absence is the message. Control was never lost. It was never hurried. It was never emotional, and most importantly, it did not need to fire first to establish it. But the question that now lingers is not whether this probe failed. It is whether the next one will look the same or arrive faster, lower, and in greater numbers. Because in the Persian Gulf, the cycle of testing does not end. It evolves. The strike group moves on. To an outside observer, nothing has changed. Tankers still transit commercial lanes. The sea remains bright under the midday sun. The horizon stays flat and undisturbed. But inside the surveillance architecture surrounding the carrier, the environment is no longer neutral. Every sensor remains active. Every sector remains covered. Because probing in the Persian Gulf rarely happens only once. The disappearance of the earlier UAVs did not erase the intent behind their deployment. It only closed that specific window of opportunity. Within an hour, long-range radar again begins filtering faint returns from the outer detection arc. Not clustered, not layered. Different this time. One contact appears alone at high altitude, moving laterally rather than inward. Its track line runs parallel to the formation at extended distance. This is not a repetition of the earlier approach. It is adjustment, testing whether posture has changed. The carrier strike group maintains the same configuration. Escort ships hold their positions within the defensive ring. No alteration in speed. The high-altitude contact lingers at the edge of coverage, never quite closing enough to trigger the earlier sequence. Below, the surface picture remains quiet. No fast boats pressing forward. No overlapping layers. Instead, there is patience from both sides. The earlier intervention has recalibrated distance expectations. What follows is subtler. A low-altitude UAV emerges hours later, but from a different bearing. It stays farther out than its predecessors. It adjusts course more frequently, as if avoiding clear pattern recognition. Inside the Combat Information Center, tracking begins immediately. No escalation, no dramatic shift, just methodical observation. Because the lesson from the earlier encounter was not about reaction speed. It was about boundary certainty. The United States does not need to chase every contact. It does not need to announce every decision. It needs only to maintain control of when and how engagement thresholds are defined. The lone UAV eventually widens its arc and retreats without crossing inner markers. No engagement is required. The absence of action this time is as deliberate as the earlier intervention. Control does not always mean removal. Sometimes it means allowing distance to hold. As evening approaches, the Persian Gulf darkens. The glare fades. The sea cools under dimming light. Night introduces new variables. Low-altitude objects are harder to visually confirm. Surface reflections change. Thermal contrast shifts. This is when miscalculations are most dangerous. But the strike group's posture remains consistent. Layered radar continues sweeping. Infrared systems monitor altitude shifts. Helicopters rotate patrols at measured intervals. Nothing suggests complacency. Hours pass without renewed pressure. No sudden swarm. No concentrated formation. Instead, there is restraint. Because the earlier response established cost. In material terms, the probing effort lost assets. In informational terms, it revealed behavioral patterns. And that exchange was unequal. The United States collected more data than it exposed. Every altitude adjustment, every delay between signal disappearance and surface withdrawal, every hesitation in fast boat movement, stored, analyzed, prepared for next time. Strategically, this is where the balance matters most. The Persian Gulf is narrow. Distances are compressed. Small movements can have large consequences. But dominance here is not defined by who can appear the most frequently. It is defined by who can enforce limits without destabilizing the entire region. The carrier strike group did not accelerate, did not issue public warnings, did not broadcast strength. It demonstrated something quieter, predictable enforcement. And predictability in a contested environment can be more stabilizing than aggression. As midnight approaches, the formation continues along its original transit plan. The airspace around it remains clear. The sea lanes remain orderly. From a distance, there is no sign that multiple unmanned platforms once occupied the perimeter earlier in the day. That absence is intentional. The operational space has been reset without spectacle. And the message, though unstated, carries weight. Approach will be detected. Presence will be tracked. Patience will be maintained. But once defined thresholds are crossed, intervention will be immediate, limited, and decisive. No escalation beyond necessity. No hesitation beyond calculation. The Persian Gulf will see future probes, perhaps larger, perhaps faster, perhaps coordinated in more complex layers. Technology evolves, tactics adapt, but the principle does not shift. The side that controls the moment of decision controls the encounter. On this day, the test unfolded without headlines, no dramatic images, no visible exchange of fire. Yet the outcome was clear. The carrier strike group continued forward unchanged. The probing assets did not. And in waters where perception can escalate faster than missiles, maintaining control without spectacle may be the most powerful demonstration of all. Dawn returns over the Persian Gulf with the same quiet light that began the previous day. Commercial traffic resumes its steady rhythm. Oil tankers move deliberately through marked corridors. Fishing vessels scatter across the shallows. From satellite imagery or distant observation posts, the carrier strike group appears unchanged, an organized formation cutting through calm water. But operational environments are never static. They remember. Signals intelligence collected during the previous encounter has already been transmitted, processed, and compared against historical patterns. Flight durations, approach angles, coordination timing between aerial layers and surface elements. Each detail is mapped. The probing was not random. It followed doctrine, and doctrine evolves only when tested. By mid-morning, electronic emissions from the coastline increase slightly. Nothing aggressive, nothing direct. Just subtle shifts in background activity. Shorter bursts of communication, brief uplinks consistent with remote piloting signals. The strike group's response remains invisible to the outside world. Data flows quietly through hardened channels. No fighter launches, no surface maneuvering, but surveillance expands its aperture by a few additional nautical miles. This is not escalation. It is anticipation. A single medium-altitude UAV appears again, this time farther from the formation than the previous day's initial contact. It does not attempt to layer itself with others. It does not descend dramatically. It simply shadows at distance, a test of tolerance after enforcement. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tracking system assigns it a clean identifier. Its flight path is analyzed against yesterday's engagement points. It stays outside, well outside. The message has been received. Hours later, a surface contact emerges near the outer arc of radar coverage. A small vessel, slow speed, no aggressive heading. It maintains a lateral path parallel to the carrier's transit. The escort ships do not adjust formation. They do not need to, because control is no longer about physical proximity. It is about decision authority. The previous day demonstrated that the strike group determines when a probe ends, not the probing side. That authority reshapes behavior. Through the afternoon, the airspace remains sparse. The earlier layered strategy, high-altitude observers, low-level skimmers, dispersed fast boats, does not reappear. Instead, there is caution. Presence without intrusion. The carrier's deck cycles aircraft as scheduled. Launches and recoveries proceed under strict timing windows. Pilots land smoothly. Maintenance crews operate without interruption. The appearance of routine is intentional. Predictability and posture reduces the risk of miscalculation. What has shifted is invisible. The margin for gray zone maneuvering has narrowed. Every UAV that approaches now carries the memory of prior removal. Every surface vessel understands that distance thresholds are not negotiable suggestions. They are enforced lines. As evening falls again, electronic silence from the probing side deepens. The earlier bursts of uplink traffic diminish. The carrier strike group continues along its transit plan, now approaching the exit corridor from the most sensitive sector of the Gulf. No dramatic confrontation follows. No final swarm. Because the objective of probing, measurement, has already yielded its answer. The defensive envelope did not react emotionally. It did not reveal excessive capability. It did not escalate beyond requirement. It waited. And when the boundary was crossed, it acted with precision. Strategically, that matters more than spectacle. In environments like the Persian Gulf, dominance is not about overwhelming force at the first hint of challenge. It is about establishing a predictable equation. Approach equals detection. Persistence equals tracking. Threshold breach equals removal. Nothing more, nothing less. As the strike group nears open waters beyond the tightest confines of the Gulf, the density of civilian traffic increases. The horizon broadens, the operational pressure gradually decreases. But the lesson remains embedded. The next probing effort, whether weeks or months from now, will arrive informed by this one. It may come lower, faster, more dispersed, or coordinated through more sophisticated timing. But it will face the same principle. Control of the encounter belongs to the side that defines its end. On this transit, the U.S. carrier strike group did not change course, did not accelerate, did not publicly declare victory. It simply continued. And that continuation, uninterrupted and unchanged, carries strategic weight far beyond any dramatic exchange. The Persian Gulf remains a narrow sea with compressed distances and amplified consequences. Probing will continue. Technology will evolve. Tactics will adjust. But as long as defined thresholds are maintained and enforced with restraint, the balance remains steady. Because dominance at sea is not proven by who tests limits most often. It is proven by who compels the other side to withdraw, without destabilizing the entire region. And in this encounter, the decision of when the test ended was never in doubt. As the carrier strike group clears the narrowest stretch of the Persian Gulf and transitions toward more open waters, the operational tempo subtly shifts. But the posture does not. Speed remains steady. Formation spacing remains exact. No celebratory messages are transmitted across open channels. No public acknowledgement is issued. From the outside, the transit looks identical to every other passage the U.S. Navy has conducted in these waters for decades. But strategic signaling does not always require headlines. Back on shore, analysts on the probing side are reviewing their own recordings. They have footage from high-altitude observation feeds before those feeds went dark. They have telemetry from low-level UAVs that briefly penetrated deeper than planned. They have surface reports from fast boats that withdrew sooner than expected. What they do not have is a clear picture of the defensive architecture that removed those assets. They observed no mass fighter scramble, no visible shift in the carrier's speed, no dramatic maneuvering by escort ships. The response was precise, minimal, and timed exactly to predefined criteria. That lack of spectacle limits what can be reverse-engineered. For the U.S. fleet, however, the informational advantage is broader. Patterns were revealed. Coordination timing between air and surface layers was logged. Reaction delays after the first UAV disappeared were measured. The moment when surface boats began widening, separation was recorded down to seconds. In contested maritime environments, data gathered during restraint can be more valuable than data gathered during escalation, because it exposes behavior under uncertainty. As night settles again over the region, the airspace around the formation remains clear. No layered returns, no faint flickers skimming the waves. Only commercial aircraft far above, and civilian ships at lawful distances. The earlier encounter has recalibrated risk tolerance. The strike group's mission continues beyond the Gulf, but its presence in these waters leaves behind an invisible imprint. Boundaries, once tested and enforced, tend to hold, at least temporarily. The broader strategic context remains unchanged. The Persian Gulf will continue to host tension, surveillance, and periodic probing. Unmanned systems will grow cheaper. Coordination will become more complex. Swarm tactics may evolve. But the underlying equation demonstrated during this transit is difficult to ignore. Patience does not equal weakness. Restraint does not equal uncertainty. And decisive action does not require escalation. The carrier strike group never ceded initiative. It never allowed the pace of events to be dictated from outside the defensive ring. It allowed observation to continue long enough to gather clarity. And when clarity was complete, it acted within defined parameters, no further. By the time the formation reaches more open sea lanes, the Persian Gulf has returned to its surface-level calm. Satellite images show orderly transit patterns. Shipping advisories remain unchanged. There are no smoking wrecks, no dramatic debris fields, no visible aftermath, only absence. And that absence is deliberate, because the most powerful message delivered during this encounter was not broadcast through loudspeakers or press briefings. It was demonstrated quietly in the operational space itself. Every approach was detected early. Every movement was tracked fully. Every threshold was enforced precisely. The side that tested limits lost assets and gained limited insight. The side that maintained discipline retained freedom of movement and strategic control. The encounter did not end with a confrontation. It ended with continuation. The carrier group sailed on. The probing stopped. And in a region where miscalculation can escalate in minutes, the ability to close a test without widening conflict may be the clearest indicator of maritime dominance. The Persian Gulf will see more tests, more drones, more layered approaches designed to apply pressure without triggering full confrontation. But the principle demonstrated during this transit remains steady. Control belongs not to the side willing to push boundaries repeatedly, but to the side that decides, calmly and deliberately, when those boundaries have been crossed. And when that moment arrives, the response is swift, contained, and final. No spectacle required. Days later, long after the carrier strike group has moved beyond the tight confines of the Persian Gulf, the encounter continues to ripple quietly through strategic channels. Not in headlines, not in public briefings, but in planning rooms, on both sides. Because what unfolded was not a dramatic clash, it was a calibration. For the probing side, the lesson is uncomfortable. Small, expendable systems can apply pressure. They can test reaction time, they can complicate surveillance pictures, but they cannot assume persistence equals advantage. Every additional second spent inside a controlled envelope increases exposure. Every layer added to a probing effort multiplies coordination complexity. And once a defined threshold is crossed, inexpensive platforms become acceptable losses. That is a difficult equation to sustain repeatedly. For the carrier strike group, the encounter reinforces doctrine that has been refined over decades. Layered detection, controlled patience, preset engagement thresholds, and minimal force application. The key is not overwhelming response, it is predictable enforcement. When thresholds are clear internally and invisible externally, the opposing side is forced to guess where those lines exist. Guessing invites caution. Caution reduces escalation. Weeks later, commercial shipping traffic continues uninterrupted through the same waters. Tankers pass without incident. Fishing fleets operate normally. Civilian aircraft cross overhead. The region remains tense, but stable. No sudden swarm follows the earlier probe. No retaliatory statement reshapes the narrative. Instead, there is a subtle widening of separation between probing assets and U.S. formations in subsequent encounters. UAVs linger farther out. Surface craft hesitate earlier. Approaches remain exploratory rather than intrusive. The memory of removal lingers. This is how operational space is shaped, not through constant confrontation, but through carefully timed intervention. In naval strategy, especially in narrow waterways like the Persian Gulf, dominance is rarely about who fires more often. It is about who can sustain presence without losing composure, who can absorb probing without escalating prematurely, and who can end an encounter cleanly. The strike group did not accelerate through the Gulf to demonstrate urgency. It did not deviate from its route to signal concern. It did not broadcast warnings to dramatize authority. It transited as planned, and that steady continuation carried more weight than visible force. Because in contested maritime environments, predictability in posture can be more powerful than unpredictability in reaction. The next probe will come. It may be larger. It may involve more sophisticated coordination between air, sea, and electronic layers. It may attempt to compress response time further, but it will face the same structure. Detection layered beyond the horizon. Tracking sustained without panic. Engagement thresholds defined before contact. And intervention executed only when necessary. That equation is not designed to eliminate tension from the Persian Gulf. It is designed to manage it, to prevent gray zone tactics from drifting into miscalculation, to ensure that testing does not evolve into uncontrolled escalation. In the end, the most telling detail of that morning was not the disappearance of the UAVs. It was what followed. Nothing. No expanded conflict, no retaliatory escalation, no deviation from mission, just a carrier strike group continuing forward, unchanged. In maritime strategy, that is the quiet definition of success, not the absence of challenge, but the ability to absorb it, define it, and conclude it on your own terms. The Persian Gulf remains one of the most closely watched waterways on Earth. Every transit carries risk. Every shadow on the radar demands attention. But as long as thresholds remain firm and enforcement remains measured, control of the operational space stays where it belongs, with the side that decides when the test ends and how.